And we're back. How's it going? Welcome to my shop. I'm James Wright, and I'm now over in my office, so this is not at my bench. But I thought today would be a really fun time to actually go and look at some of the data from the glue test that I just did. Now this was a far more detailed test than I originally intended to do, and I when I originally looked at the test, my first thought was which glue is the best, and I kind of understanding that once a glue reaches a certain level, the strength of the wood, then it's really whatever's left. But I quickly came to the conclusion that there were a lot of other things to learn about glue, and this test really brought out a lot of those. So today I want to actually go into looking at the data here. If you haven't seen the spreadsheet, there is a link to it on the video I just put up. Let me actually put the link in the chat here. Let's go view. So copy that and throw it over here. I should have thought of that earlier. So if any of you want to watch, the link to the spreadsheet is over here, and I'm going to be actually sharing my screen here in a moment and showing what all I have on that. Let me go ahead and do that right now. Actually, before I do that, let me talk through just a couple other things going on in the shop. I've been working on this glue test, and it's been kind of consuming my life, and I'll be talking a little bit later about some of the things I want to do with the glue test in the future. But as of tomorrow morning, I am starting working on the dining room table, which should be a lot of fun. I'm I'm looking forward to actually doing that. This is going to be a table. It's about 11 foot long. At the widest point, it's 47 inches wide, live edge. I'll probably be doing a lot of epoxy filling, not like a river table, but there are lots of voids and other things. And there'll be a couple lakes about that big. So it would be an interesting thing to do. And yeah, slab top about 1.5 inches thick, and then a large trestle base that I'm really looking forward to building. So hopefully that will be starting later tomorrow, and I will be doing a lot of detailed videos on that, as well as a regular update video so that people can see how that's coming. If any of you have questions about things we talk about, go ahead and throw them in the chat. If you can just highlight them or put question at the beginning, just makes them easier, because I can't always watch all of the chat, but I will be keeping my eye open for it. So let me do this. Screen share. And I am sharing an ultra wide screen, so that can be a bit difficult sometime, but you'll see. Screen share. There we go. As I edit on an ultra-wide screen, which is really nice. One of these days, I want to get a regular format to go above, but for now, we'll work on this. So now you get to see, let me actually move this over so you can see a little bit more detail this way. There we go. So this is the data, the raw data, and I'm actually looking at the wrong spreadsheet. This is the earlier one. Oh my, I'll have to pull that up. Just a moment here. Let me go into you, because I have like several renditions of it as I edited things and made them cleaner. Let me go to this one here. This is the actual spreadsheet if you want to follow along. Put that in the chat. And I'll try and put that in the description if you're watching this in the past or future. Or yeah, future. If you're watching this in the future, if you're watching this in the past, that's actually rather impressive. Glue test. Let's put that in there. Hey, there's the right data. Now, one of the things that I first want to say, a lot of people had questions about raw data versus PSI. Because the blocks I were testing were 3/4 inch by 1 inch, that brings it up to 3/4 of 1 square inch. Well, PSI is pounds per square inch, so I can just change the formula slightly to bring it up to 1 square inch. It just makes it a little bit easier to understand in PSI. So in the columns here, there's raw data as well as PSI, so you can look at that. This was really, really kind of interesting to me to see how this all came out. And most of the time, I may be referring to things in PSI, but if you look at them in raw data, it really doesn't matter. It's just a bigger number in PSI and a smaller number in raw data. So let me move on to the long grain to long grain and go through some of the surprising things on there. Yes, time is fluid. Yes, especially with time changing. There's actually people watching this who are ready in the future. If you're like in China, woohoo! You're already in tomorrow. Um, the big surprise of this whole test was cheap super glue being number one of long grain to long grain. Now, that being said, if you look at the chart over here, you can tell that some of the East Coast resin did better than some of the super glue, and so this bar is showing the strongest result and the weakest result, being then in comparison. So you can see how some of them were really, really up there. Like the maximum weight from East Coast resin was 872 psi, which is just that's a lot of pressure. But average is there. Now, the one big thing about super glue that I want to test in the future is, well, number one, shock. This was putting a little bit more of a constant pressure on there. Sorry, I can't zoom in because I'm sharing an ultra wide screen. So it doesn't, yeah. And unfortunately, Google Hangouts doesn't. Well, actually, let me see if I can do a cut application window. Oh, I can do an application window. Sweet. Let me see if I can do this. Share. Ah, cool. They finally added the feature. So I can show just this screen. So let me back this out and see. That should look a little bit better to you. Let me try and format it to right about there is the average screen size. So I hope that makes it a little bit easier, because my screen is 6K, so it's 4K plus 2K longer. Yeah. So let me see if there's any questions here. Yeah, now you got me off the topic. Now, one of the two tests for super glue, number one, it's shock, because this was putting in a constant growing pressure until it snapped. In the future, what I want to do is actually put the scale and have it dropping and shock it. So it's just a bang of pressure. So it's suddenly more pressure that it can take. And at that instant that it breaks, what was that PSI? So I'm going to be playing with how to actually test that. That's going to take a whole new rig. So that probably won't be out until like the fall or so. In that case, I don't expect to do super glue to do so well. I don't expect epoxies to do very well at that. I expect the PVAs to do really well at shock, but I don't know. Who knows until we get there. The other thing is long-term study. I'm planning on starting to do a study here soon where I'm going to glue up like the 5 or 6 best glues. One PVA, one construction adhesive, one super glue, one epoxy, and do up a whole series of them and set them in my garage. And once every 6 months, bring out a test and run them and see how they do over the next 5 to 20 years. And so like once every 6 months, then that gives me a chance to put out a video and say, hey, we're testing this set. And look at this, epoxy is dropping off, or hey, epoxy is increasing, or who knows? Do high glues get better with time? Do PVAs get better with time? I don't know. Who knows? Maybe super glue actually gets better with time. I kind of doubt it, but you never know until you try. So I'm looking forward to actually doing that long-term test. I have the data. Sorry, I'm looking through. If you have a question or something you want me to read, put like a question at the beginning so I can see it. I'm trying to read through the chat as well. My wife isn't here today. She is working. But maybe one of these days, Wood by Wright will take off enough that my wife doesn't have to work, and we can do a team, because that's one of the things we've actually wanted to do, is do several builds with my wife in the shop. Thought that would be a lot of fun, but can't always do it because she works a full-time job. Let's see some of the other surprising things to me. You look at the 2P10s, because I tested the thin, the thick, and the gel all with activator and without activator, and I expected the activator to be fairly similar. And with the thin and the thick, the activator was very similar. But with the gel, the activator always did worse. And here you can see the gel, 2P10 gel, the without activator was 334 psi, and 2P10 without it was 250. So almost 100 psi different between the two of those. And I'd like to do a couple tests to find out why the activator with the thick is very close, but with the gel, it's different. And I think part of it is because the gel takes longer to set into the wood, and so it needs that curing time. Whereas the thick and the thin are thin enough that they still will flow into the wood before the activator hits it. Whereas the gel, the activator hits it before it gets a chance to go into the wood. I don't know. That would be something fun to test out. And the future tests, I'm going to be doing several of the construction adhesives. So if anyone has a glue that they really want me to test, go ahead and feel free to send it to me. Send me a contact and I'll get you an address to send it to. Having several people in other countries that are sending me some glues that are specific to their country, things that I can't buy here, and that way I can put them in the test. So in the future, when I do another string of tests, I'll be able to put the exact same data up against this data, so we can see, you know, how does Titebond do up against a PVA that comes from Europe. I'm guessing they'll be fairly similar, but who knows? Let's see. White Elmer's craft glue. You know, it's down the list a ways, but it's still at 240 psi, which in my book, anything over like 150 to 100 psi is far more strength than you need for a decently made joint. Because, you know, if a decently made joint is there, it's going to hold itself together, and you're not going to be getting as much shock. You're not going to be getting as much vibration. Your wood movement should be taken into consideration. So the White Elmer's glue, you know, if I was low on money and I had to build something and all I had around was my kids' craft glue, I would feel comfortable using it. That was, I really expected that to do farther down the list. It was actually right in with the strength of the high glues on most of the glue tests. So it was kind of cool. Which glue shocked you? Most of the super glues, the CAs. I was expecting them to be far more brittle. I mean, you know, this didn't test shock as much, but they really held up really well, especially the cheap super glue. The cheap super glue I had was a fairly thick one, and its consistency was right in between thick and gel. And I would really be interested to see, why did it do so much better on the long grain to long grain than the thick and gel 2P10? And I think that was due to a couple outliers that just kind of pushed its top PSI up there. But it still, its bottom PSI was better than the bottom PSI of the 2P10s. So I'd like to do a couple other tests to see, why did the cheap super glue stick up there? Am I using cheap super glue as my go-to wood glue? No. Number one, its setup time is too quick for most applications. And number two, I don't know its long-term study, so that will be interesting to try out. Let's go down this a little farther. In the long grain to long grain, the Gorilla Glue did do better than most of the high glues, which after doing the gap filling, that surprised me. But the Gorilla Glue for long grain to long grain with a nice tight clamp isn't that bad. It actually works rather good. It's not my go-to glue because it makes a mess and it's hard to clean up, but it's a decent choice. Let's see what else came out on this one that was interesting. Yeah, and all of these, I really expected the contact adhesives to do better, but most of those failed rather spectacularly. And they did not have as much flex as I expected. I expected them to kind of move a little bit before they break and then slide off. But they didn't do that. They just kind of popped like the other ones did. They just popped really early. The high glues actually fell in pretty close. The 315, the 251, and the 192, they were exactly as advertised. The 351 is stronger, the 251 is weaker, and the 192, I probably wouldn't use that on anything but like applications or marquetry or things like that. That would be a good use for it. Yeah, that's kind of cool. But as you can see, even those high glues at 200 and 224, they were still well within the range of a really solid wood glue. So, question: think the clear Elmer's glue would do as well as the white glue? I have no idea. If I have space, I might add the clear Elmer's glue, but I'm trying to just do glues that are often considered acceptable for wood glue. I've heard a lot of other people using the white Elmer's glue, so that's why I added that to the last one. Yeah, let's keep going. Let's go on to the long grain to long grain, and it's gonna be long grain to end grain. And I was expecting this one to be a total failure across the board. I really did not expect. Um, I did not expect anything massive. The one really nice thing about this is the standard deviation on these were actually much, much better. Um, the standard deviation was fairly tight and fairly clean. Why did I put PSI on standard deviation? That's confusing because that's not a PSI. I should take that out. One of the things I just noticed. Standard deviation is, did all of the breaks happen at a very close point together, or were they spread out over a larger area of the graph? And on the long grain to in grain, they were all fairly tight together. So if you look at the graph over here, with the exception of the 2p10 gel, which had a very wide range, most of them were fairly tight together. And you can see in comparison to the long grain to in grain, some of these were a lot longer out here. This is the long grain to long grain. So in this, the results are fairly good. In grain, I was expecting the epoxies to do really well. I wasn't expecting the PVAs to do really well. They kind of have a bad thing with that. Originally, I was expecting the Gorilla Glue to do well, but right up here in the top, gel, thick and thick, epoxy, tight band, Elmer's glue, even the high glue, they were all really close together, 340 to 356. That's not that huge of a spread to have all of them in there. So basically, on in grain to long grain, they're all much weaker than long grain to long grain, but they're all rather decent. I was honestly surprised. I was expecting most of them to break around like the 100 150 psi, and you really have to go down a ways before like this is the breakdown here. Tight Bond Original, DAP foam board. That's kind of like the breaking point where I'd be like, yeah, I wouldn't use any of these on long grain. So I'm not going to use the super glue and wood glue. That the super glue and wood glue almost always did poor. So unless it's something like an application, I don't plan on using the super glue wood glue trick much more. Yeah, and then you get down here into the high glues. Most of the high glues, the old Bond and the dry high glues didn't do very well. The homemade high glue actually did really well. So that's I'm trying to find other ways of testing the homemade high glue a little differently because it usually did a little bit better than the other ones. I was expecting to be a lot closer together. Yeah, this was the other one where let's see, West System 206 slow did better than 205 fast. And I think that's because the slow had more time to get into the pore of the wood, whereas the fast had less time to get into the wood. Whereas in most of the tests, the fast actually did better than the slow. And I was expecting the West Systems to be up much higher, but I don't think I would use them on in-grain, with the exception of this 5-minute epoxy. It's way up here, which I don't. That's kind of an outlier, but it's a really tight graph here. You can see how there isn't much deviation on that. So it's a fairly trustworthy result. So I don't know. The more tests need to be done. Why did the faster epoxy do well here? But in this case, the faster epoxy didn't do as well. I don't know. And then East Coast Resin is way down here. So who knows? And then thin 2p10 did almost nothing. So there's some really surprising results on there. But this has really basically made me feel okay with the PVAs. And actually the super glues. If I'm doing like a small bowl or something, I have in-grain to in-grain connection, I might do some super glue in there. But I'll probably stick with the PVAs because I know them and trust them a little bit better. So for in-grain, PVA is my go-to choice. Let's see, any questions over here? Question: when gluing boards edge to edge, out of clamps, when using wood glue, which type 2p10 would you use as a type of clamp, and does that work? So are you saying using 2p10 to hold the boards together until the wood glue sets? That's what I was testing here with the, where is that one? I have wood glue and super glue. Where'd it go? I'm completely missing it. Here we are, number 12, super glue and wood glue. That's where I tested that one. I did not clamp that in place. I just let the super glue hold it in place until the wood glue set. It is an okay glue, and let me see back here. I think it was down here a ways. It was, it's not a really strong glue. In most cases, the super glue and wood glue together did worse than either super glue or wood glue. And so I don't know if the super glue and wood glue interact with each other or they cause problems. But the test of using super glue to hold the wood glue in place until it sets, you lose strength doing it that way. So I don't think I would do that for like a tabletop. I would not do that for a tabletop. I would use clamps or some other methodology. But if it's something like I'm applying something to the flat surface for decorative purposes, a lightweight thing, yeah, I might do that. That's 172 psi is not bad, but it's not a really strong connection. Question: what do you think attributed mostly to the failure of glue in exterior condition tests? I'm going to be getting to that in a moment when I get to the exterior conditions, because I have a few things that I'm thinking about doing with that in the future to see. Number 18. Yeah, so let's move on to gap filling. Gap filling was actually the first test I did, and so that was kind of the great surprising moment for me to see how it did. And the best gap filling glues were the Titebonds and the super glues. I was not expecting either of them to do it. I mean, most people are saying, gap filling, don't use the PVAs, don't use the PVAs, but they did significantly better than the next closest epoxy, which I was really expecting to do well. Let's see, the first epoxy is a 5-minute epoxy, and it was at 286 psi, whereas even the Titebond 2 was 374, so almost 100 psi more for the PVA over the epoxy. Now, one of the things on the gap filling, you can tell that the standard deviations are much larger. So the results on these, I don't trust quite as much, because I'd probably need to do a larger sample size than 10 to get a really clear view of it. But it's enough to at least get a good idea that 100 psi difference between Titebond 2 and 5-minute epoxy or East Coast resin made it fairly clear that they're better for gap filling than epoxies. So that's probably something that is strong enough of evidence for me to change my average. If I have a gap, I would have originally used an epoxy. I'm probably going to be using a PVA, even over the high glues, which in the past I probably would have used a high glue even better than a PVA. Speaking of which, again, the homemade high glue was up there fairly well. And seeing that the gel and the thick, and in this case, the gel with activator did just about as well as the gel. And I think that's because it didn't have to soak into the wood. It just had to fill the gap. And for the thick, for the gap filling, what I did was I literally filled the gap with glue. So it was completely containing glue, and then attached it so that the void was completely filled. And with the gel, it would fill that void and stay there. Whereas with the thin, it would all run out of that void. And so I think that's why the activator didn't have to have as much of a problem with the gel on the gap filling. But again, I was really, really surprised by the 2P10 at gap filling. That was just pretty much mind-blowing. What would be the best glue for laminating a tabletop? So like boards edge to edge, if it's inside, I would use a Titebond 2 or Titebond 3. That is a phenomenal grain. That's the long grain to long grain test. If it's outside, I would probably use the West system. If you go by the numbers, the best one is going to be the West system fast. But the Titebond 2s aren't terribly far behind that Titebond 2, Titebond 3. So for laminating a tabletop, I would probably stick with the standard PVAs. Unless it's outside, then I'm going to be using the epoxy. But we'll be getting to that in a moment. Back to the gap filling. What other interesting things were there in here? The high glues did okay at gap filling. Not really happy. I mean, Old Brown was 200. The 315 was 240. So they're decent. But I think I would still use the Titebond 2 or Titebond 3 for gap filling. But the super glues, the 2p10, that still blew my mind as to how surprising they are. Again, I don't know how long the super glues will last long term or how well they do in shock, but they've definitely made my mind that if I'm turning something, I'm working with a bowl on the lathe, um, they're a legitimate wood glue, and I will be using them more. So that's enough to let me know that I can trust them more than I had in the past. Then of course down here you have Gorilla Glue, 46 psi. I wouldn't trust that with one of my kids. So pretty much the super glue and wood glue were not good gap fillers. That went way down there. DAP foam board, and in this case the cheap super glue did not do well as a gap filler, and that's why I really don't know about this cheap super glue, because in the long grain to long grain it's the best. The long grain to in grain it's medium, and then the gap filling it's way down there, and it did not hold in consistency to the 2p10. So I don't know what to take with that. I'm probably going to have to do some future study on that. It may be that there is a slight variation in tube to tube, even though I got them all in the same package. I was using a different individual tube on each test. It may be that there is change in that. I don't know. Might have to do future tests in there. But then all the way down at the bottom again, we have the contact cements, Super 77 barge, just not as good. And in most of the case, I found that the barge actually did better than the thinned barge, which you'd kind of expect. I would like to do some other tests with that, like on leather, because that's where it really comes into its own. So I guess if you thin it out, just expect it to be a little weaker. Let's see, any questions over here? Were all the glues stronger than the wood itself? Because, from my estimation, I don't know this particular wood itself. In the next test, I'm actually going to be doing a board, and someone suggested this, and I thought it was a fantastic idea, because I was trying to figure out how to make a control for this. How do you actually judge it against something else? And I hadn't really thought of it. But he was saying, if you just carve out, so if I get a board that's an inch and a half thick of maple with the grain running vertically, and then I carve out a socket, I carve out a mortise that is an inch deep by 3/4 inch wide, and then just try to shear the grain off of itself, that would give you a clear estimation of where it is. And so I'm going to be doing that on the next test. That will give a really cool idea. But basically, I think that anything over like 150, 180 psi, that's the break-even point for me on is it stronger than the wood itself. So that's kind of the standard that I'm using right now until I test more. So yes, that was also the reason why I used maple on this test, because I wanted to see. Maple's like the worst case scenario for a domestic wood is that it's hard, so it's difficult for the glue to work into the wood. It's not very porous. It's also going to withstand more force, so it'll take more before the wood breaks. And if you notice in a lot of the tests, I had the data on there of what tests actually broke some wood, and it was actually fairly rare. I was able to get a fairly consistent test of what the glue itself is. I will be doing other tests sometime in the future with like oak and pine, and trying some other woods with more porous woods. I might get something like an ipe or something that's oily. Those will be interesting ones to test. For my estimation, to answer your question, is it stronger than the wood itself? Most of the glues over like 150 to 180 psi, I would say are stronger than the wood itself. But until I test that, I don't know. So that will be a fun one to actually test and see how strong the wood is in shear like that. Another question. So this test was one of purely shear strength. Any plan to do other types? No. Well, for number one, almost all the glue joints that we have are shear. So if you look at like dovetails, or you look at mortise and tenon, or bridle joints, or even like tabletop joints, shear is where it's at, because in tension, especially if you're doing long grain to long grain, the wood will break long before most any glue will. wood does not have much strength with with the grain, as in pulling the grain apart. Um, and because of that, there really is no good way of testing just the glue in tension. You can't glue two boards together, long grain to long grain, and pull them apart and expect just the glue to break. And that would really be way down the list. I think that even some of the contact cements might be able to hold up stronger than long grain to long grain in tension. So I don't have any intention to test tensile strength. Number one, because it's a very difficult test to get a clear result on, and number two, it's not actually a test that is often used in actual woodworking. It's not a force that is often used in woodworking. So, yeah, that's my intention on that. Did you use plastic resin glue? I don't know what you mean by plastic resin glue. Um, yeah, further clarification, let me know. Question: how did you test long grain to long grain? I have an entire video. There is a link in the description of this video to how the tests were actually conducted, and you can actually see a video of doing a series of the tests. So if you want to see that there, um, just want to say thank you. Well, thank you. Cool. There's the questions on that. So let's move on to the exterior test, and this is where things really got interesting, because let's see, where is it down here? Titebond 3 is listed as an exterior glue, and I had several boards where Titebond 3, the blocks fell off the board before they even got to my shop. Now, I have to be fair, I really put these in the most severe conditions they could possibly be in, but they were pure Mother Nature sitting outside. So they got UV radiation from several sunny days. They got rain. They went through three frost freeze cycles. So that was actually um, they got beat up quite a bit. And so it's the worst case scenario, but I was expecting them to come in and at least have some strength. And some of the Titebond 3s lasted, but here you can see the maximum strength was like 470. It was like 47. And that is not enough for me to last. And my standard is about 150 psi. But if you do come up here, there were quite a few that held up to that standard of 150 psi. So like super glue to wood glue, that was actually one case where it did better than the wood glue. It did worse than the super glue itself, but apparently there was enough super glue on there to hold it to 159. But the super glues were the champ in this. 2p10 gel, cheap super glue, thick, 2p10 thick, 2p10 gel with activator. Let's see, that is 5 of the top 7 slots are all super glues. Well, then right underneath that, super glue and wood glue. But then you have the West systems right in the middle here. That I was actually really surprised by those results. Enough that now, in the past, if I had an exterior project, I would use the Titebond 3. I will not use Titebond 3 in exterior projects. And looking back on it, I've had a couple exterior projects that have failed that I've used Titebond 3, and I just chalked those up to bad joinery or early projects. And now I'm looking at it as like, well, maybe it was just the glue failing. So for future projects exterior, I'm going to be using West System or other decent epoxies, probably the West System, because the East Coast resin was down here a little ways, and there's the 5-minute epoxy was down a little ways, but the East Coast, the West System held up really well. So yeah, I was not happy with Titebond 3. And then of course down here, all the hide glues died except for my homemade hide glue that lasted a few times. I was actually really happy my homemade hide glue did better than Titebond 3. But that just tells you how bad Titebond 3 is. It was really kind of sad. Let's see, are there any questions over here? Now I want to see 2 Gorilla Glues together. What do you mean by that? In my next test, I'm going to be testing Gorilla Wood Glue, and I will be testing Gorilla Contact Cement, not Contact Cement, Construction Adhesive, and seeing how well those do. Should be kind of interesting. I'd like to see Titebond 50. I've not heard of Titebond 50. I'll have to look that up. Oh, you're in Brazil, so that might be something down there. Yeah, if you want to send me some Titebond 50, I'll put it in the next test. So yeah, like to see it. Plastic resin glue comes powdered and you mix it with water. I think that is the Cascamite. Because that's something that I ordered in from Europe, and that was a white powder that got mixed together with water. Did not do well in the exterior conditions, and none of the blocks made it to it. Long grain to long grain, the Cascamite did okay. Actually did really well. It was at 317 psi. So it's a good long grain to long grain. I think it failed in the long grain to end grain. Yeah, long grain to end grain, it was only 51 psi, and gap filling, it was down 29 psi. But I'll have to look at it and see if it's a plastic. I've never heard of plastic resin. But yeah, who knows? Question: I meant end grain to end grain, but I said the wrong thing. With the setup you had on the long grain video, I could see how you would make the backboard end grain. No, the long grain to end grain, yeah, that's in the video I had. But basically, I just the connection block that I put on there, long grain to long grain, I rotated it so that it was end grain to long grain. So the end grain was on the block, whereas the long grain was the substrate that it was glued to. Question: would you do more exterior test, like indirect exposure versus direct exposure? That is actually what I'm kind of interested here, because I want to do another round of tests with construction adhesives and other things like that. But at this time of the year, I'm not going to be able to test that freeze thaw cycle that I had in the earlier ones. So in the long grain to long grain, the long grain to end grain, and the gap filling, I can match those exactly and get one-to-one connections. So in the next test, I'll be able to match those and get accurate data of saying this glue is compared to this glue. I won't be able to do that for the exterior conditions. I'm going to have to put a big caveat in set and say completely different exterior test, because the next one will just be rain and UV, and then normal temperature swings. So I won't be able to test the freeze thaw cycle, but I am thinking about doing another run of these 32 glues again for exterior in the summer, and see if that makes a difference, as opposed to the freeze thaw cycle compared to just being in rain and sun, and seeing if that makes it easier for the glues to withstand it. So yeah, that's something I would like to do. Direct exposure as to indirect exposure, that would be kind of an interesting test, but I don't know what you would mean by that, as you would kind of have to, I mean, they have to get wet, because it's exterior. If they don't get wet, then it's interior. I guess I could put them in my garage and let them withstand, as opposed to air conditioning in the house. But yeah, I don't know. I have to think about that. For exterior tests, did they cure, dry inside? Yes, they cured and dried inside before I took them outside. And they were outside for 2 weeks. And then when I brought them in, I tested them in a wet condition. So it had just rained, and I brought the boards in one by one, and so they were actually tested in their wet condition, which I figured would be the worst case scenario. So if it's in the rain and there's still weight on it, does it hold? So there's that. Question: would you prefer a glue consistent everywhere or just one test? Would you prefer a glue consistent everywhere or just one test? Oh, like PVAs. You got to use a glue as to the situation. You can't just have one glue in your shop. One glue does not do really well. So like for this, I'm going to be using PVAs a lot more for my internal. I'll be using PVAs for pretty much everything wood inside, and then West System for everything outside. But then for like turning and small projects where you're like filling cracks, or you're gluing a crack back together, the super glues, I was really impressed by them. I will be using those in turning, although I would like to do the long-term test. I'm not going to know that for another 5 years. So for right now, let's leave them alone. And I'm going to be using that more. The hide glues, one of the surprising things was the Titebond hide glue. Here, let me go back here to the long grain. One of the tests I wanted to do was, is it worth getting a liquid hide glue as opposed to a dry hide glue? Because the dry hide glues are a lot of fun. So you come down here like the 315, the 251, and the 192. But in all those cases, let me find it where to go. Like my own hide glue, Old Brown, and where's the Tight Bond hide glue? Tight Bond hide glue is down here. The Old Brown and the Tight Bond consistently did just as well, if not better, than the 315. So if I don't have time to mix up some dry and I want to use the Tight Bond, go for it. It's quick, it's easy, it's useful, and I can trust it as a hide glue. Another test I want to do in the future is testing transparency, because one of the big benefits of using a hide glue is the glue is transparent. So if you have a little bit of glue smeared out on the wood, the oil will soak through it much better than it will through a PVA. Whereas with a PVA, you get that stain on the wood where oil can't get to the wood. Hide glues are better at that, but I actually want to do a test and see how much better. Is one hide glue better at than another, or is there some glue that will do better at than that? So that should be kind of interesting to see how transparent are there, and that might be another reason for it. But most of the time, I'm going to be using those 4 glues. A 2P10, a West System epoxy for outside. I'm probably going to stick with Tight Bond 2, not Tight Bond 3. Tight Bond 3 is a little stronger, but I don't need that strength. If my joint is any good, the difference between them is negligible. And I can get Tight Bond 2 in a 2-gallon jug. And for how I go through glue, that's fantastic. So West System, Tight Bond 2, 2P10, and then hide glues. I'll be using the Tight Bond squeeze bottle hide glue for most things, but every now and then when I really want to get artistic, I'll probably use my own hide glue that I've mixed up. And so that's probably the list of glues that I would have in my shop or need. But each one of them have a different variation. There's other things to choose. There's price to choose. And that's one of the reasons why I'll go with Tight Bond 2 as opposed to Tight Bond 3, is it's cheaper to buy it in the gallon. And it becomes a much cheaper glue than Tight Bond 3, which you buy in the smaller squeeze bottles. So different glues have different reasons. Plastic resin glue is a brown powder. Okay, so no, I have not used it. If you want to send me some that you like, and I'll try and add it in the next test. I've never come across that, so cool. Love to see it. There are so many glues out there. I could do this string of 32 tests another 4 or 5 times and not touch all of the glues that people would use for wood glue. I'm hoping to do like a fish glue in the next one, a bone glue. I've thought about doing a brain glue. We'll see. You can make glue from any body part. They pop. We know high. Yeah. Well, we know high glue high glue will behave after 100 years. Well, we also know how PVA will last over 100 years. PVA is well over 100 years old, and if you look at a lot of the arts and crafts glues, they were PVA, and some of the PVA will withstand a little bit better. High glue, it really varies heavily on how moist the environment is. So if you leave a high glue piece of furniture out in the garage where there's a large moisture swing, over time the high glue will break down faster than the PVA. But if it's inside in an air-conditioned world, the PVAs actually last a little longer than the high glue from historical focus. So we have data on both PVAs and high glues over 100 years, and they're both good long-term glues. So yeah, and that's one thing I would like to see right next to each other in the long-term test. How well do they last? It will be interesting. When you test the exterior, did you finish the samples? No, I did not finish the samples because most of the time when you finish something, the first place the finish is going to degrade is at that joint, and so you'll get water coming in there. So it was kind of like the worst case scenario, but no, I did not finish them for exterior use. Question. Clarification: direct exposure versus indirect exposure, freeze thaw, heat cycle, UV exposure versus freeze thaw, heat cycle, UV exposure. Oh, without UV rain exposure. How much does UV matter? I don't know. That will be one of the interesting things I'd like to actually test is because with the exterior conditions, I'm not testing individual variables. I'm just testing Mother Nature, and so I would like to actually do a series of them and put them in my garage and just water them down once with a hose, add water to them, and see how they withstand. And then another time, pick 3 or 4 sunny days and leave them outside on days that are consistently the same temperature and have the same amount of sun, and see how the UV affects them, and see if there's any difference to the raw data of just long grain to long grain kept inside. That would be good data. More tests for the future. And as you can see, the more I dig into this, the more data I get into, the more data I'm like, ooh, I could do that test, and I could do that test. And I see this being something that I'm regularly testing throughout the next few years. We'll see how that does. What about fish glue? That will probably be in the next test. I have actually a friend from Europe who is sending me some fish glue. Uh, is it useful, strong enough? From what I've heard, fish glue is a fairly good glue. It tends to be a little bit more stretchy. But we'll see how that goes. Yeah, and another test I'd like to do is the what's the word I'm looking for? Taking joints apart. So which glues come apart the easiest with heat, or which glues come apart the easiest with moisture? Because with high glues, if you heat them up, they will slide apart. And if you add a little bit of humidity in the air, they will slide apart a little bit easier with heat. Whereas PVAs, you have to add more water. Heat doesn't affect the PVAs quite as much. But this is hearsay or what I've been taught. I've never actually tested it. And so it would be kind of interesting. Is reversibility, there's the word, to test the reversibilities of different glues. Can you reverse epoxy? How hard is it to break? How hard is it to break 2P10 or super glues? And once the boards come apart with high glue or with PVA, can you clean the glue off so you can put them back together and reglue them? That is interesting data, especially for, you want to make heirloom quality furniture, and 200 years from now, a joint cracks from normal use. Well, any of these glues are eventually going to have glues that crack. That's just the nature of long-term life. Can it be reversed, cleaned up, and put back together? And that might make that glue more valuable to you. That'd be an interesting test to do. Burley Woodworks. Yes. The dovetail chisel to be a little wider. I'm actually be doing a collab with Burley Woodworks here. And if you haven't seen his channel, he's in the chat right now. Definitely check him out. He'll be making the steel pieces for a chisel, and I'll be making the handle for it. That should be really kind of cool. So I'm looking forward to that. But making a dovetail chisel where the tip of it flares to the wider, so it's like a 1/4 inch thick at the shank, but then the tip is about a 1/2 inch wide, making it easier for getting into the corners of like the half blind dovetails. So I'm looking forward to playing with that. Oh, Weld Bond. I didn't realize Weld Bond was a plastic resin glue. Yes, Weld Bond. I actually just ordered some of that. I'll be putting that into the next set of tests. So that should be an interesting one. Where do you get your high glue? Do you have to order it? I actually have links in the test videos. The last one I did, down in the description, I have a link to all the glues that I tested, exactly the glue that I ordered, so that you can see the exact glue. So if I'm talking about a high glue, like a 315, this is the supplier I got it from. This is the batch I got it from. So if you want to see the exact glues I got it from, that's that. I don't have the high glue supplier off the top of my head, other than Old Brown or the Tight Bond liquid glues. Greetings from Wales. Hey, how's it going? My parents are actually going to be out in Wales in the next month or so. Thank you. I'm as excited to see you. So yeah, a lot of other tests coming along, and this data is kind of cool. I'm going to keep this spreadsheet, and when I do other tests, I'm going to try and keep it all in the spreadsheet. So there'll be other tabs down at the bottom for other tests that have been done, or if they are one-to-one tests like the long grain to long grain, the long grain to end grain, and the gap filling, I'm going to be able to duplicate that and do the exact same test again in the future. So I'll have all of that data then in those tabs and in the raw data sheet, so that you can see this all. So this is kind of a really, it geeks me out. I really enjoy this. The numbers coming through. Video wise, it doesn't do quite as well. It's a decent video, so it's not a well producing video, which most channels out there, if this didn't do well, they would never touch it again. But for me, I really want to do this data because it is intriguing, it's interesting, and it's something that a lot of people want to know. And not everyone out there can do a test like this. So this is something I really want to be a part of. So yeah. So if you have any particular questions before I wrap this up, go ahead and post them in the chat. And I'm just trying to see if there's any other surprising data that came up. Most of the surprising data I've talked about, but yeah, the 3M 5200. It was supposed to be good stuff, and that stuff was a pain to work with. It took 7 days for that to set. 7 days of having it in a clamp, and it was just slow and maintenance. It did have a lot more flexibility. It was a very rubbery glue, but it didn't have much of any adhesion at all to the wood. I could see it being a much better glue for some of the metal tests or plastic, but I don't know. It was listed as a marine glue, but didn't do very well at all. Let's see. Magnus asks, what can we do that would help you with future tests? Any ideas on what would be a benefit? If you have a glue, send it to me. If you're in the area, maybe we'll do a glue test day. But it's kind of something I have to do here. And most of the money that I've needed to put out for it was into the frame and the testing supplies. So that's here. I will need to buy more maple in the future to do the long-term test. I'm going to be doing the next batch of 32 glues before doing the long-term test, so I can pick the best 5 or 6 glues. We'll see how that goes. But I mean, really the best way is just your support, saying thank you, joining on Patreon. And so that's about all. Unless you're local and you want to come over and help me someday, maybe you do that. But a lot of it's something I have to slowly work at because I can only have so many clamps to clamp them in. So I can only do a round of a glue or 2 at a time. Yeah, for Make Brooklyn, I was just featured in the Popular Woodworking blog. So that the test from the wood glue is posted on there. There'll be a few others that might be coming in the future. We'll see. How to make and use high glue. Actually, I have videos on that. Oh, you're saying, oh yeah. Okay, I see you're answering another question. So thank you. Yeah, I have a video on how to make and use high glue. Actually, I think I have a video on how to make and then another one on how to use as well. And I was really impressed with the high glue I made. I was expecting it to be a weaker one, but I think because it was just the cream of the crop coming off the top, it was only the best of the polymers in the hide. So I was really happy with it. And I think if I'm going to be using dry hide glue, I'm going to probably be using that one because I like it. Plus being able to say I made my own glue from rawhide. It's a nice thing to say. I wish I could show you the control chart for 2p10 gel. It's very good across all tests. Joe Baker. Sure, I'd love to see it. I don't know what chart you're talking about, but it looks interesting. Yeah, I have not come across, there's several other channels who have done glue tests, but they're not as broad, or they just have one instance of each glue, or they're generally testing the glue in the joint, and so it's not actually testing the glue, it's testing the joint capability. And so this is the first time I've seen. I'm sure a lot of the glue companies actually do internal tests, but I've never actually seen their data or how their tests are taken out. And I don't think they're as broad. I think they're more like comparing one of their glues to one of their other glues. So this is kind of a new cool thing. Um, Thank you, Tyler. You're asking. You should say I should make the data sheets available for a nominal fee. I try and make most everything as free as possible. I do sell plans, but I usually sell them for like $2, $5, or several of the plans are free, and I think some of the big ones are $10. So I don't try and make a huge amount of money on that. I don't like selling things as much, and that's one of the reasons why I don't sell anything that I make. And so I want this data to be as open as possible. And there's something in me that the scientist in me wants to say, if you put data behind a paywall, then it's less trustworthy. And being able to make the data wide open to peer review and have people look at it and say, I didn't like how you did this test. That makes the data a little bit stronger to me. So I really don't want to make that pay. If someone likes it and they want to, join Patreon for a month or two, cool. I don't want to push anyone into that. For people who have the money and they want to do that and they want to say thank you, thanks. That means a lot. But I really want this to be open to everyone, whether or not they have the money or the capability to do that. Because there was a time I could not have done that. Our money was strapped, and I would still have interest in this, and I'd like it to be open to people who are in that situation. What about clamping time? Yes, I'd also like to do a clamping time. I would like to clamping time test. I'd like to do a clamping pressure test. I would like to do what's the other ones? Working time test, and actually have like a lubrication. I'd like to actually test friction joint as opposed to clamped joint. There's a lot of tests like that I have on my list that I would like to actually do, and we'll see how those come. I had no idea you could make it so. Do you work for Fast Gap? Oh, Joe Baker. I got lots of maple for you, James. Yeah, if you have anything, let me know. That's the thing. I'm being very picky about the maple I'm using. I want it to be really nice, clean, straight grain, and then it has to be exactly 3/4 by 3.5 in order to fit into the jig. And so I'm buying it all pre-planed, so that it's nice and smooth. And then I take my smoothing plane to the surface to clean it up before actually attaching. So I think I'm about done here. Since you have kids, is there a taste test coming? Yes. I like the taste of Elmer's glue. I have good memories of eating Elmer's glue. But yeah, this has been a lot of fun, and I'd love to hear if you have any ideas of future tests you'd like to do. Let me know. I'm keeping a list of future tests, but the glue test will kind of go on the back burner for a little bit while I build the dining room table, and I'm really starting to get excited about doing this. So this should be a really, really fun, big, beautiful build, and yeah. So that's about it for now, and until next time, see you later. Where is that button? There it is. Stop.